Well, good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome all of you. My name is Tom Kahn. I am the proud board member and the chair of the policy committee of JDCA, Jewish Democratic Council of America. I also have to confess I wear another hat because I'm a proud board member of the Israel Policy Forum, from which our guest will be speaking. And I want to thank every one of you for joining today's program. But before we start, it's important just to note, I think many of you have already seen this, but political activist Charlie Kirk was shot this afternoon. And just to be clear, the attack on Charlie Kirk is reprehensible, unacceptable. And in the United States of America, we have got to reject every form of political violence, every single form of political violence. So our prayers are with him and his family for a speedy recovery. Now on to our program. It's been almost 2 years since Hamas's horrific, despicable attack in Israel on October 7th. And in the months and years ahead, we have been anguishing and demanding the return of every single hostage. And we are also been calling for increased humanitarian aid for the Palestinian people. Today, we find ourselves at a very precarious moment because there are still 48 hostages. Some are living and sadly some are dead, who remain in Gaza, and a ceasefire seems ever further away and every day it seems further away. And of course, we'll see what the events of yesterday will bring. And also, I think we note with great sadness the killing of at least 6 people at a Jerusalem bus stop. And as I mentioned before, the Israeli targeting of Hamas leadership. There are no easy answers on where we go from here. Fortunately, we are joined today by Michael Koplow, Israel Policy Forum's Chief Policy Officer and one of the foremost experts and commentators on the Middle East, Israel, and American Jewry, to help us distill current events and make current sense of the situation on the ground. And by the way, if you don't get it, I strongly urge you to subscribe to the Koplow newsletter. It is a superb weekly summary of events in the Middle East. Michael, we are very, very grateful to you for joining us today. We're thrilled to hear your insights and we're thrilled by your partnership. And now let me hand things over to JDCA CEO Halie Soifer. Actually, no, I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael, and then later I'll turn it over to Halie Soifer.
I'll actually take it from here. Thank you so much, Tom, and thanks to Michael for joining us. Michael, we'll just start with questions, and for the audience, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we're going to try to get to as many as possible. So, Michael, as Tom mentioned, there have been developments in the past few days that may make achieving a ceasefire in this nearly 2-year war even harder. Talk to us about yesterday's strikes conducted by Israel on Hamas leadership in Doha, and what are the implications for ceasefire negotiations? We know that members of Hamas leadership were meeting in Qatar to discuss the U.S. drafted proposals. So what might these strikes mean, especially for those 48 hostages still in Gaza?
Thanks, Halie. Always good to be here. And of course, there's a lot to talk about. So, as presumably everybody knows, yesterday Israel launched airstrikes in Doha aimed at Hamas political leadership that was gathered there reportedly to discuss their position on the latest American brokered offer to end the war. This is the offer that the United States reportedly gave to Hamas, where all Israeli hostages would be released, reportedly on day one, in return for an end to the war and an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in phases, and reportedly tied to benchmarks in terms of Israeli security. And as President Trump said earlier in the week, the U.S. was waiting for a response from Hamas, and Hamas leadership was all gathered together, something that does not happen all that often. And so Israel seems to have taken the opportunity to strike at Hamas leaders in Doha. We don't know Whether the strike was successful, there are conflicting reports. The latest reports, at least as of like 10 minutes ago, are that Israeli officials are skeptical that they actually took out the Hamas leaders that they were intending to take out. Hamas says that 5 people were killed, but none of them the high-ranking Hamas officials. So we really don't know whether this was successful in achieving what it was trying to achieve. There are a number of angles here, and some of them you raised in your question. So I think that the most important and pressing one is this question about what this does to hostage negotiations, because, of course, these were the Hamas leaders based in Doha who were in charge of negotiations. And I think there had been renewed optimism over the course of the past week that perhaps a deal was getting closer. We saw renewed engagement from the administration. We saw this new offer that we hadn't seen before. I think that there is plenty of evidence to suggest that the threat of an Israeli invasion of Gaza City, a ground invasion of Gaza City, was making Hamas at least come back to the table. And I don't know that it would have actually gotten them to accept the offer, but there seems to be movement. And obviously, this makes that far more difficult. So I think there are questions about if there are negotiations going forward, who does Israel negotiate with? And we have seen over the past 2 years Israel take out Hamas leaders in various places. There was the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, the killing of lots of Gaza-based Hamas leaders, of course. Each of those killings, which frankly I think are defensible and probably merited on their own right, given that these are Hamas leaders who planned and perpetrated the October 7th attacks, each of these came with a claim that it was going to make negotiations easier, that the leaders that were targeted were either particularly hard line or that it was going to be a message to Hamas that they had to agree to Israeli demands. And that didn't really happen in any of those cases. So, I think that there's a question here as to even if the leaders who were targeted were in fact killed, whether this will make Hamas more likely. There's a question as to who you now negotiate with, because certainly Israel can try to negotiate with the Gaza-based leadership, but that's not how it has worked up until now. There's also the question of who is going to host any mediation going forward, because if you are the Qataris and you have been the mediators and also hosting Hamas in Doha, and I think it's worth a reminder that the Trump administration, when they took office in January, explicitly asked the Qataris not to expel Hamas leadership from Doha because they wanted them there so that there could be somebody to negotiate with on this territory. So, I think there's a question as to whether Qatar will be willing to continue to host negotiations. If they aren't, who will? Does it automatically move to Egypt as the other mediator? Are other states going to be wary of something like this happening to them on their territory? And then I think finally, there is the issue of the United States and its involvement here. And while I haven't seen any suggestion that the U.S. was involved, there are conflicting reports as to whether Israel informed the United States ahead of time or whether this was coordinated with the United States. There was reporting yesterday from Barak Ravid that the U.S. was not notified and that Trump administration officials were upset. We saw a statement from the press secretary and from President Trump himself. There have also, I've had conversations in the last 2 days with Israeli officials who say that the U.S. did indeed know that this was coming. Either scenario frankly is odd. If the U.S. did not know this was happening, it's really an extraordinary step for Israel to take without getting a green light from the United States, let alone notifying the United States. And if the United States did know about it ahead of time, and if this was somehow coordinated with the White House, there too, the timing is very strange given this new U.S. offer that was on the table, and given the renewed efforts by the administration. So I think we still have a lot of questions about this, but it's difficult for me to look at this and think that this is somehow going to benefit the release of the 48 hostages remaining in Gaza and the 20 of whom the 20 who are reportedly alive. While I don't know that this necessarily seals their fate, I think it certainly sets the clock back and makes any negotiation harder. And the last thing I'll say is that it's important to reiterate that 148 living hostages have come back since October 7th. Only 8 of them have been rescued in IDF operations. The other 140 have come back either through negotiations or through unilateral Hamas quote unquote goodwill gestures. So there really is no way to get the hostages back without negotiating, and this certainly makes negotiations much tougher.
So as this operation was playing out yesterday in Qatar, the Israeli government, Netanyahu himself, warned and ordered the complete evacuation of Gaza City. And the expanded offensive, which it looks like it's begun today into Gaza City, followed nearly a month of IDF operations on the outskirts of the city. What are the objectives of this renewed Israeli offensive in Gaza City, and how do you see it playing out?
So until yesterday, as I mentioned, there was a theory that the plans for the ground offensive in Gaza City and the airstrikes that have been conducted now for nearly a week were in the service of effectively softening up Hamas's position and making them more pliant in negotiations. I think that it's safe to conclude after yesterday that that was not the aim, and that the Israeli government has, in many ways, definitively chosen to take a purely military approach. That being the case, then we should take the Israeli government at face value. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that the aim of the operation in Gaza City is going to be to secure the release of the hostages and to defeat Hamas. As I as I said, I really don't see a way in which the operation, if it is carried out, is going to secure the release of the hostages in a comprehensive or effective manner. And when it comes to defeating Hamas, this is certainly not the first time that we have seen the Israeli government before an operation say that this is the operation that is going to finally defeat Hamas and bring an end to the war. And I don't think that that's for lack of trying or because IDF operations in Rafah or the recently concluded Gideon's Chariots operation were not thorough. The uncomfortable fact is that Hamas is replacing its fighters as fast as Israel kills them. They're replacing them, let's be clear, they're replacing them with 15-year-olds who they hand a bandana and a gun and they say, go fight Israel. And unfortunately, there is a steady pool of recruits. And so there just doesn't seem to be a way for the IDF to kill every last Hamas fighter. It's just not possible. And so the defeat of Hamas is going to have some sort of political component, and it's going to happen over time. There's a reason that IDF leadership itself, while if it's given the order to carry out the operation, will certainly do it, that they've been reticent to actually go through with the operation. And there have been multiple reports that Eyal Zamir, the IDF chief of staff, has warned the prime minister and warned the cabinet that the operation is likely to endanger the lives of the hostages. So I think that at this point, it's more likely than not that we're going to see an IDF ground invasion of Gaza. It's not going to be quick. The IDF itself estimates that this operation might take up to a year. And while it will certainly kill more Hamas fighters, and hopefully the IDF will be able to destroy some of the infrastructure that is underneath Gaza in terms of tunnels and Hamas positions, ultimately, this operation is likely going to end the way previous operations have, with a large amount of destruction, many Hamas fighters killed, but many more recruited. And I think that it's impossible to discuss this operation or really the last year and a half of the Gaza war without pointing out that Prime Minister Netanyahu has strong political incentives to continue the fighting because he is reliant on two members of his coalition, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who are adamantly opposed to ending the war in Gaza. It isn't only about Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. There are many other ministers, including Likud ministers, who also want to see the fighting continue. And the longer that the war goes on, the longer that Prime Minister Netanyahu can keep on saying that there cannot be an inquiry into the war because the war is ongoing. And in a different context, we saw something along these lines last week where the Israeli state comptroller issued a report taking the government to task in all sorts of ways for their lack of preparedness on the home front, which hampered the response to October 7th. And the prime minister's office responded by saying that, aside from contesting the findings of the report, saying that it was completely inappropriate and outrageous for anybody to issue a report like this while the war is ongoing and right before a new operation is about to happen in Gaza City. So while there certainly are military objectives, real ones, from this operation, it's hard to divorce it from Prime Minister Netanyahu and the government's political incentives, which really are being brought to bear on this too.
Okay, just to prod a bit more on that point, yesterday, following the strikes in Doha, you had a really important thread, I thought, on X, and you wrote, "For nearly 2 years, Bibi has promised total victory and insisted that war will bring hostages home and he will defeat Hamas. For nearly 2 years, that has proven untrue. This is a doubling down on that strategy. We'll see if it works as the Israeli government wants, but I remain skeptical." So as we very soon mark 2 years since October 7th, I'm wondering if the stated objectives of the Israeli government are achievable in Gaza, how this war might end, and is it possible that it ends with Netanyahu and his current coalition in power?
I don't think that the objectives are achievable simply through more fighting. That's clear to me on the hostage front, and it's clear to me on the defeating Hamas front as well. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has laid out 5 requirements for ending the war. And there are requirements that will take a long time. And in theory, you can have all the hostages back through a deal, but completely disarming Hamas, that's not going to be a quick process. The complete demilitarization of Gaza, that's not going to be a quick process. Finding a new entity that is neither Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority to govern Gaza, that is also not going to be a quick process. And so if those are the requirements, along with the last requirement being Israeli security control of Gaza. So if the war cannot end until all of those things are fully met, then that means the war is going to go on for a very long time. And the IDF is incredibly capable, and they've used an enormous amount of force in Gaza, and they have not defeated Hamas based on the standard the government has set. I have to say, if I were the prime minister of Israel, I would have declared victory over Hamas in terms of defeating them a while ago, because the IDF has taken what was effectively a military, not a terrorist force, but a military that controlled territory with 33,000 fighters organized into brigades and battalions, not terrorist cells, but literally in military formations, with rockets and all sorts of other things in their arsenal. That was Hamas's status on October 6, 2023. And right now, while there are still plenty of Hamas fighters, given how fast they are filling their ranks with new recruits, they don't resemble a military force in any way, shape, or form. They're basically now a bunch of guerrilla cells, and they still control swaths of Gaza. They still have their infrastructure underground, but they don't have rockets. They are not set up to fight, and they're not trained and they're not armed anywhere close to the same way they were on October 7th. And so there's a very plausible and reasonable standard here to say that Hamas has been defeated militarily. And when we talk about what it means to remove Hamas from governance, that can only happen if there is an alternative, if there is planning that goes into it, if there's actually some sort of mechanism for some other entity to take over Gaza. There are all sorts of ideas and plans out there for what that could be, but none of them have been implemented, and none of them are close to being implemented. And frankly, they can't be implemented while you still have a kinetic war going on in Gaza. So I think the government has set up a standard that is impossible to meet, given the constraints they've also imposed on themselves. One of which is that this insistence that there can be no Palestinian Authority role. And while the Palestinian Authority is far from perfect, and a deeply flawed and corrupt and kleptocratic organization, Palestinian politics is effectively a two-party system. And one of these parties, Hamas, is far worse than the other by any standard or measure. So you've got to work with the people that are there that are not Hamas. And I think that until the Israeli government comes around to the idea that they have to have some sort of PA involvement. It doesn't mean the PA taking over Gaza tomorrow by any means, but some sort of PA involvement in whatever administration gets set up. You're not going to be able to replace Hamas's governance. And so, we're in this unfortunate endless loop, and it's hugely damaging, obviously, to Palestinians first and foremost, where we're now, I think, close to the 65,000 mark in terms of Palestinians who've been killed in Gaza. Many of them, of course, are Hamas fighters, but certainly not all of them, and not even 50% of them. The amount of damage in Gaza is catastrophic. It's going to take decades to put all this back together. The ongoing war is also very damaging to Israel and to Israelis, where we're now seeing the first signs of real dissent among IDF reservists who have served 200 days, sometimes 300 days, over the last almost 2 years in reserves, and they're getting called up for a fourth, fifth, or sixth time, and they don't want to do it. It puts pressure on them, puts pressure on their families. It's putting huge pressure on the Israeli economy. I think we all see the way in which Israel is having huge diplomatic challenges in Europe, in the rest of the region. I think important to note that the Abraham Accords are still holding, but Israeli firms were just today barred from the Dubai Air Show, which is a big important weapons show. And so this is the UAE. This is not Israel being barred from an air show in Europe or an air show in a country with which it doesn't have relations. And in the United States, we all see what is happening to Israel's image, whether we measure it by what happens on college campuses or whether we measure it by what we see in polling. So, this has been very damaging, and there doesn't seem to me to be a lot of utility or frankly even marginal value to continuing the war the way it's been going on. And you asked about whether it's conceivable that this war will end under this Israeli government. Unless President Trump forces an end to it, I really find it hard to see this Israeli government turning on a dime and shifting course. And what that means for Palestinians and for Israelis is that they may have to wait more than a year, another year, until this war is over. And I think that every day it goes by, the more damaging it becomes.
So to focus for a moment on the situation in Gaza in terms of the humanitarian crisis, last month, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or the IPC, which is an international body, characterized a famine, characterized Gaza for the first time as a famine, prompting calls for Israel and the international community to do more to ensure the flow of food into Gaza. How do you describe the humanitarian situation in Gaza? What is your assessment of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's efforts to distribute food? And what more can Israel and even the United States do to alleviate the humanitarian crisis there?
So first of all, there's been lots of discussion and debate over the famine designation. I think that I think that the designation was problematic for a number of reasons. We don't need to get into it in excruciating detail, but it was based on data that was collected months before. In some cases, it was based on surveys of literally a dozen people. The standards were changed. So, I think that I think there's plenty of evidence to question the famine designation. With that said, it doesn't matter because there's no question that there was real hunger and enormous amounts of suffering in Gaza. So whether it's the argument over whether it's a famine or not, I found to be a bit silly. The situation for Palestinians in Gaza was terrible and in many ways remains terrible. Thankfully, it is much better now than it was a couple of months ago. And it's for a few reasons. Israel basically enacted a complete embargo on aid for about 2.5 months, from the beginning of March till a little after mid-May, which is when the serious shortages began to happen and things began to run out and prices spiked. And that's when Israel started to let some of the NGOs operate again in Gaza. It's also when the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation got off the ground. And so today, what we have is basically 4 different mechanisms operating at the same time in Gaza. They each have their benefits and they each have their drawbacks. You have the UN system, you have the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, you have efforts that are happening from individual states like Egypt and the UAE. Excuse me, and then you have sort of aid groups and commercial traffic that are kind of operating outside of any of these mechanisms. The amount of food that's going to Gaza at this point is sufficient. The UN says that you need 62,000 tons per month of food as a baseline, and in August, almost I think actually not almost, I think double that amount went into Gaza. So the amount that's actually going in is sufficient. The problem isn't about food getting in. The problem is what happens once the food actually crosses into Gaza. And here, the different mechanisms have different issues. So the mechanism that NGOs are doing through the UN, and that's groups like the World Food Program or the World Central Kitchen, they are getting a lot in, but their stuff, almost 90% of it is getting looted at some point during the process. And sometimes it's being looted by criminal gangs, sometimes it's being looted by Hamas, sometimes it's being looted by hungry Palestinians who are just taking it. And different organizations have different approaches to this. There are some that have a policy of just letting anybody come and loot it, because at least people are getting the food. There's some organizations that are hiring private security, effectively criminal gangs, to try to protect it. But as I said, almost 90% of the stuff is getting looted at some point during the process. Then you've got the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is at the moment, I think, operating 3 sites. Their aid is not getting looted at all, because with them, the IDF has established safe corridors that goes from the entry points in Gaza to the GHF distribution sites. And so their stuff isn't getting looted on the way in. They distribute all of it. The problem is that a number of problems, actually. One is that they're only running 3 sites. Just for comparison, before the humanitarian cutoff back in March, there were about 400 distribution sites in Gaza, and there are more now because other groups are back in, but GHF is only operating 3. And so if you want to get to a GHF site, maybe you live close by, but maybe you don't. And they're only operating in southern Gaza. And so people have to walk very far. They're also distributing 45-pound boxes of what they say are meals, but I think is misnamed. They're not making meals or even distributing food that's ready to eat. They're distributing these boxes of largely dry goods. So things like dry pasta, dry lentils, bags of flour. They've recently started to distribute also potatoes and onions, but all things that I should also note that they're partnering with an organization called I think Samaritan's Purse to now distribute things like baby formula. So they've ramped up this stuff over time, but still what they're distributing has to be cooked. And if you have to go and collect a 45-pound box of these things to use them, you then need water, you need cooking oil, you need a working stove or a working oven. All things that are in very short supply in Gaza. So I think there's a question as to how useful these things are without additional assistance of some sort. And what we're also seeing is that um, because the sites are basically they open them up for X amount of time each day, and they're basically a free for all. The people who are going to the sites are almost entirely young, fit young men, and they're taking the stuff. There's no way of knowing who they are. I'm sure some of them are certainly civilians, but could be also Hamas fighters who are just showing up because there's no tracking mechanism. And then a lot of stuff is then it's not being looted on the way in, but it's effectively being looted on the way out because once they get beyond the GHF sites, there are black markets at each of these sites that spring up literally right outside the perimeter where people then resell all the things they just took from the GHF site. So not being looted on the way in, but certainly, lots of it being looted in course. GHF has set up new hours for women only to avoid that sort of thing, and those are more orderly, but the regular distributions are far more chaotic. And of course, there was the problem early on, which thankfully seems to now have abated, where lots of Palestinians were being killed on the way to the sites, going through these corridors, either because they were not lining up, because they were coming before the sites opened. So it was a huge humanitarian and security problem. Don't have to go through the other two. The airdrops are very inefficient. Egypt and UAE are also running their own things, but they're running through clans, so that's also problematic. And then you've got the fourth bucket of sort of one-offs. So all this is to say that stuff is coming in, but until you actually have security in Gaza, until you have safe corridors for everything, not just for the GHF aid, until you have roads that are actually passable where trucks can deliver things, until you convince Palestinians that aid isn't going to disappear tomorrow, because recall that over these 2 years, there's not been a consistent policy. There was initially no aid, then Israel was letting it in, then it got cut off again, then there was the ceasefire, then Israel cut it off completely for 2 months. Now it's restored. If you're a Palestinian in Gaza, why would you trust that this is going to keep on flowing reliably? And so, until there's security, until there's some sort of confidence among Palestinians that this is not temporary, until you can really scale up things like kitchens and bakeries that can actually cook meals as opposed to just this being dry goods, then I think we're going to continue to see looting and shortages. But the good news in terms of what people can do or what countries can do, Israel controls 75% of Gaza by its own calculation. I think it's got to do a better job of safe corridors and general security and coordinating with aid groups. And I think a lot of the aid groups, they've been reluctant or refusing to really work with the IDF on security. And I think that that might need to change. That might need to change as well. And it's going to take a while for this to get fixed. But there are problems that are here on all sides. I think there's plenty of fault to go around. But the good news is that the situation in terms of just food that's going in and access to food and prices dropping is far better today than it was a couple of months ago. And so still very bad, but I don't think we're anywhere close to the crisis that we were seeing during the summer.
So it's no secret that there have been some Democrats and some Republicans advocating to restrict or cut or condition military assistance to Israel, largely due to the situation in Gaza. What do you make of these efforts, and how do you respond to those asking whether U.S. military assistance to Israel is needed at this time? Additionally, what do you make of the distinction that some Democrats have established between offensive versus defensive weapon sales to Israel?
I understand the frustration among members of Congress, especially if, and I hear this, by the way, I should be very clear. I hear this from both Democrats and Republicans, who don't don't understand what Israel is still trying to do in terms of the fighting and what's left to accomplish. This is not only on one side of the aisle, and so, but we are, we are seeing it manifest more among Democrats and Republicans. If you are a member of Congress and you think that this war should end, and you don't understand what added utility there is to Israel continuing to fight in Gaza, and you're horrified by some of the scenes that you're seeing in Gaza, whether it be casualties or food shortages. If you're a member of Congress, you really don't have many options. Certainly you can speak out and criticize or condemn what's going on, but ultimately what Congress has is the power of the purse. And so I think that's why we're seeing, what seems to be almost a very quick sea change in terms of what people are willing to consider. And we're seeing it take different forms. There are some members who make a distinction between offensive weapons and defensive weapons. There are some members who are talking about things like end-use restrictions, so saying to the Israelis, we'll still sell you whatever weapons you want, but we're going to put restrictions on their being used in Gaza, use them anywhere else, but not in Gaza. So we're seeing it take different forms. Listen, I should say up front, I'm not in favor of conditioning assistance, and I'm also not in favor of end-use restrictions. I understand the politics of it and why we're seeing it more, but I'm not in favor of it, and it's for a few reasons. I don't think anybody questions that Israel lives in a dangerous neighborhood. The fact that it is a less dangerous neighborhood today than it was a year ago is largely because of this security relationship between the United States and Israel, and the fact that Israel did have what it needed from the United States to really diminish Hezbollah's capabilities enormously and to fight back against the Houthis and to strike Iranian nuclear sites. So, sure, Israel is in a better position, and there's an argument that its security needs are not the same today as they were a year ago. But I think that we should always be cautious about whether that's a permanent state of affairs or a temporary state of affairs. And when it comes to things like end-use restrictions, my concern is that it's almost impossible to track. So sure, you can vote to put end-use restrictions on weapons that are sold to the Israelis, and you say, all right, here are a bunch of 500-pound bombs, not allowed to use them in Gaza. We don't, and this isn't only with Israel, it's kind of anywhere. We don't really have great ways of monitoring that. And so, I worry that it ends up being something that maybe releases the political pressure valve, but there's no way of tracking it or making it operable. And then we've introduced a new degree of friction into a U.S.-Israel relationship that is certainly important to Israel, but is also really important to the United States. So it's a tough issue, and the frustration with Israeli policy is real. And again, there aren't that many avenues to deal with it. And to me, this is one of those issues where I wish there was a perfect answer. I wish there was an answer that could protect the U.S.-Israel relationship and make sure that Israel's security is not eroded even one iota, and also not only send a message to the Israelis that we're unhappy with the continuation of the war and with, in many cases, the conduct of the war, but do something that will actually convince them to end it. But not every very thorny problem actually has a solution, and here, I just don't think there's a good solution. And so, I know where I stand on this. I understand why we see members of Congress going in a different direction. I think it's a really difficult issue, but I very much question the certainty in some quarters that if we only sell Israel defensive weapons, or if we put end use restrictions on whatever we sell them, that somehow that is going to get the Israeli government to shift course and end the war in Gaza. I actually don't think it will do that, and I think that there are, as I noted, some very serious downsides and drawbacks to taking that approach.
So speaking of aid, this is not just American lawmakers that are calling for restrictions on aid. More countries, especially in Europe, have said they will no longer provide weapons to Israel. And some countries have declared their intention to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state. How might unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state at this time actually undermine prospects for a two-state solution at some point in the future?
I think the theory behind unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state, in many ways, is similar to what we're seeing in terms of the previous question, where you see a lot of countries that are frustrated that they haven't been successful at ending the war or at moving Israeli policy in ways that they want to see. And so they're putting this on the table as a way of trying to create some sort of positive momentum. I think and again, to be very clear up front, I don't think this is a great idea. The problem for me is that unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state isn't actually going to change anything on the ground. My friend Samar Sinjalawi, who's a Palestinian sort of a Fatah dissident. His name may be familiar to people. He's in the last year, I think, had op-eds in the New York Times and the Atlantic, and was also, I should note, was supposed to be with me both in DC and New York this week, but was not able to get a visa because the Trump administration has suspended visas for all Palestinians. I should note he is not a Palestinian Authority official. He has what I think is the right take on this, which is that you can have every country in the world recognize Palestine, but the only one that matters is Israel. If Israel doesn't recognize the state of Palestine, then recognition from everybody else isn't actually going to make a difference. And I think that if you want to actually improve the lives of Palestinians, even if doing this will give them some sort of short-term hope, you've got to actually change things on the ground. And that's not going to be done with unilateral declarations of statehood. I also worry that if a lot of countries go and recognize a Palestinian state, and Palestinians will understandably be excited about that, and then indeed nothing actually on the ground changes, and their daily life doesn't change, and they still don't have a government, and certainly not a responsive government, I worry that that's actually going to radicalize them further, because at that point, you're going to have Palestinians who say that this whole thing was sort of a scam. And so the only options available are to take the Hamas route and take up arms against Israel, or to reject statehood entirely and say, just make us Israeli citizens. And when that happens, that's the end of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And it's also the end of Palestinian national sovereignty, at least in the short and medium term. So I do think that there's a potential downside as well to raising people's hopes. Let alone the complication it's going to cause if you recognize the state of Palestine. Is it in a set of borders or not? If it is in a certain set of borders, then what does that mean in terms of how you interact with Israel going forward, which will not at that point, in your eyes, be conducting military occupation of the West Bank, but will be conducting an occupation of another sovereign state. How do you do something like this when we still have not just the war, but a giant mess going on in Gaza? Are you recognizing a Palestinian state in just the West Bank, or are you incorporating Gaza as well? Finally, and this shouldn't be used as an excuse that Israel can employ to kind of run the clock out forever, but the Palestinian Authority is in no way, shape, or form prepared for statehood. And I think that You hear this from Israeli officials a lot, and they're not wrong. And like I said, it shouldn't be used as a way to just play out the clock forever. But the Palestinian Authority is not set up right now to really run very much beyond the confines of Ramallah. And I think that there should be some sort of demands of the Palestinians to, as best as they can, because of course Israel has a huge role in this, get their house in order before they go to statehood. People like to compare all the time, and I think an important comparison. Before you had a state of Israel, you had a huge set of institutions that Jews in mandatory Palestine set up, from the Jewish Agency to the Haganah to the Histadrut. They prepared themselves for statehood when that day would come. And the Palestinian Authority has a lot of work to do before they get there. And having a Palestinian state that collapses, within a matter of days, I don't think is in the interest of Palestinians in any way, shape, or form. So I respect the good intentions that many have behind this move, but ultimately I think that it definitely could be damaging, and I certainly don't think it's going to actually change anything for the better for Palestinians in the here and now.
I should have mentioned earlier that we've begun to take audience questions. I'm combining them at this point. So we have two different questions here as one. Today is the 5th anniversary of the Abraham Accords. How is that looking now? Won't the strikes in Qatar and earlier today in Yemen make it more difficult for Arab states to normalize relations with Israel?
So the Abraham Accords, are holding after 5 years. That's not surprising to me, and I think it's absolutely something we should be happy about. The prospects of them expanding, though, I think are less certain given everything going on. I'm less worried about, in this regard, I'm less worried about the Israeli strikes in Qatar or in Yemen, which I think is a completely separate issue. I'm less worried about that than I am about the impact of the Gaza war on normalization, because there's this idea out there in some quarters that as soon as the war ends, things will just get right back on track, and it'll just be a matter of time before you have normalization with Saudi Arabia, which will open up the door to normalization with all sorts of other countries. And you hear this from Israeli officials, by the way, this idea that I think Ron Dermer said a few months ago that a year from that point, I think it was some point in the spring, that a year from that point the war would be over, and also there would be normalization across the region. The politics of this has changed in lots of countries. I mentioned already just what we saw today from the Dubai Air Show in terms of banning Israeli firms. We've also had increasingly harsh statements from the UAE over the past few days, not only in response to the strike in Qatar, but also in response to Israeli plans or Israeli discussions about West Bank annexation. And the relationship with the UAE is far and away the strongest. And you can see how their politics are changing in regard to what's going on the ground. In Saudi Arabia, the politics are just much different today than they were on October 6, 2023. You've got the daily flood of images from Gaza. You have the fact that it's much harder for MBS to take risks given the state of the Saudi economy, where they're now running, I believe, the 3rd year of a budget deficit, which is sort of mind-blowing when you think about in the context of Saudi Arabian history. And they've announced that they're not going to be investing in any more projects outside of their own borders. When you have warning signs for the Saudi economy and a religious establishment that never was comfortable with MBS to begin with, for him to kind of step out and make moves on normalization with Israel as soon as the war ends, I think that's a misreading of how the politics there have shifted. It's going to take time for these relationships to be put back together. Thankfully, the defense relationships, from what I can tell, are still pretty robust, and the military to military relationships are still very strong. And so, I think we're more likely to see a period of time that looks more like it did pre-Abraham Accords, where Israel did have these robust defense and intelligence relationships underneath the table with many of these states, but they were reluctant to normalize publicly. I think we are going to get to regional normalization and expansion, Abraham Accords expansion at some point. But they're just, I think, lots of wild hopes out there about Saudi Arabia, about Syria, about Lebanon, and we're far away from those. And until the Gaza war ends and there is some real and viable plan for reconstruction, and there's some, crucially, movement toward Palestinian self-determination and sovereignty, I think Abraham Accords expansion is going to be very tough to pull off.
So, Michael, our final question. You have mentioned a few times that perhaps, and only perhaps, if Trump gets involved, could this war actually end? What do you think President Trump should be doing to ensure an end of this crisis, to ensure those hostages come home? What additional leverage does he have over Netanyahu that he may not be currently using?
I think that one of the advantages that President Trump has is that Prime Minister Netanyahu is very clearly afraid of him. He's afraid of his volatility, but he's also afraid of him politically. President Trump remains very popular with Israelis, far more so than Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the Prime Minister has seen President Trump go after world leaders in all sorts of ways, from Zelensky to Modi to leaders in Europe to Mark Carney. He does not want to be on the receiving end of a Truth Social blast from President Trump. So it very well may be as simple as that President Trump just has to forget about cutting off arms or sanctioning Israel. I think that if President Trump were to come out tomorrow and very clearly say, I want an end to the war, this is the deal on the table, I want Israel to agree with no strings attached, no conditions, that would force Prime Minister Netanyahu to take a different approach. And what we've generally seen from President Trump before he took office, when he sent Steve Witkoff over to scare Netanyahu into the second ceasefire, the one that was in operation from January through March. That was basically because he told Prime Minister Netanyahu, if you don't do this, I'm going to be angry. And since he has taken office, what we've largely seen is President Trump going along with whatever the Israeli government's position is on any given day. Even when we think about things like partial deals versus comprehensive deals, the original Witkoff framework was a partial deal because that's what Israel was demanding. And then a few weeks ago, when Hamas reportedly agreed to what's been described as 98% of that framework, then Israel said, no, we don't think that's operative anymore. Now we only want a comprehensive deal. And so the administration flipped again and said, okay, now we're going to go for a comprehensive deal. I think President Trump has to decide what he actually wants. And if it's important to him, he will be very clear with the Israelis about that. And I think that he does have the ability to move the prime minister if he really wants to do it.
Well, no easy answers.
There never are.
No, I will say on a lighter note, once again, you've gotten compliments for the photo behind you. If you want to briefly describe it to our viewers.
Sure. This is a lithograph of Ted Williams' last at bat in September 1960 in Fenway Park, where he hit his 521st home run on the last pitch of his career. I should note that I have other Red Sox lithographs in my house, and maybe at some point I'll switch this one up just so I can keep on answering the question.
Okay, and just connecting it. What gives you hope, Michael, in this moment?
There are a few things. One we've already talked about, the situation for Palestinians in Gaza, at least from a humanitarian perspective, is much better today than it was a few months ago and even a few weeks ago. I think that's going to continue. Just given what the administration has said and given the way they've associated themselves with the GHF and with the humanitarian plight of Palestinians, I think that this is something where even this Israeli government understands it can't monkey around with. So, that is better, and that gives me some hope. Also, today Elizabeth Surkoff, who was a PhD student at Princeton and a dual Israeli-Russian citizen, she had been held by an Iraqi militia, Kataib al-Hezbollah, for the last 2.5 years. She came home today, which is fantastic. Somebody who was an Israeli colleague, and that gives me hope that despite the bleak picture that we started with in terms of the remaining Israeli hostages in Gaza, it does give me hope that that there's hope for them, and that hopefully we will see them come home very soon as well. And we're entering the high holiday season. It's definitely a time for hopes and expressing what we want to see ahead for the new year. And I think we should all be hopeful, even if we are pessimistic about the state of the world. I think we should all be hopeful about what the new Jewish year will bring.
Thank you so much. Wishing you and everyone a Shana Tova. I'm going to turn it over to Bobby Saferstein to close today's program. Bobby.
Thanks, Halie, and thank you, Michael, for your invaluable insights and analysis, and to each of you for joining us today. We're grateful that you're a part of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, JDCA, your political home and voice advocating for our Jewish and democratic values. Here are 3 ways that you can join us right now. Number 1, please visit our Action Center at jewishdems.org/action to write to your members of Congress and join our many efforts on a myriad of issues that we're facing right now, including opposing GOP-led attacks on critical services, from federal security grants for synagogues to our social safety net. To join us, please click on the Resources tab below and click on the proper link. Number 2, from now until Election Day on November 4th, please join JDCA as we phone bank in support of Democratic candidates for Governor Mikey Sherrill of New Jersey and Abigail Spanberger in Virginia. Our weekly phone banks take place every Tuesday night from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern. To register, please click on the proper link in the Resources dialog window. And number 3, we hope you'll consider becoming a JDCA member or increasing your membership level. JDCA members gain access to exclusive benefits, including intimate conversations with some of today's leading thought leaders. And it's because of your financial support that we're able to make an impact. To become a member and support our work, please click on the appropriate link in the Resources dialog window. In closing out today's program, we continue to demand the immediate return of all the hostages held by Hamas. We call for an end to the suffering of all innocent civilians impacted by the war, and we pray for the day when there's finally peace throughout the region. Thank you again for joining at JDCA. Have a great rest of the day, Shana Tova, and we'll see you again soon.